Welcome to our webinar on academic mindsets and behaviors, prior achievement, and transition to middle school. We're happy to see you here and thank you for coming. I'm Lisa Lefevre, a Senior Program Associate at West Ed, and I'll be moderating today's session. So, a bit about the Regional Education Laboratory West, or REL West. We're one of 10 regional labs in the country funded by the Institute of Education Sciences. The goal of the labs is to promote the use of data and research evidence to inform policy and practice. We work with educators, policymakers, and other stakeholders to identify their priorities and key questions, and to conduct evidence-based technical assistance and applied research studies that will help address these priorities. REL West serves California, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. Today's presenters are Jason Snipes and Alexander Jacobson. Jason Snipes is the Applied Research Lead for REL West and the lead for the REL's partnership with the Clark County School District. He has over 25 years of experience in research in education and youth development. He has a deep interest in using research and evidence-based technical assistance to promote racial equity, as well as an interest in approaches that leverage psychosocial factors and early indicators to promote student success in the transitions to middle and high school. Alex Jacobson is a researcher for the REL West with a background in technical assistance and policy analysis, as well as research. Alex's prior work has included projects focusing on educator quality and professional learning, as well as teacher labor markets, education finance, and cost analysis. And a little bit about our agenda. Today, we'll cover the following. Jason will provide some background on academic mindsets, what we mean by that term, and the transition to middle school. Alex will then provide an overview of study findings themselves. We'll then put the study findings in the context of other evidence on this topic. There will be an opportunity for Q&A afterwards. Finally, we'll close and ask participants to complete a short feedback survey. The webinar is scheduled to run for an hour, ending at 1 p.m. Pacific time, but we do have an extra half an hour set aside after the conclusion if anyone has more specific questions that they'd like to stay on and discuss with Jason and Alex. So now I'm excited to turn over the presentation to Jason to talk about academic mindsets and behaviors, prior achievement, and the transition to middle school. Jason.
Thank you, Lisa, and thank you to all of you for attending. In today's session, what we hope to do is to increase your understanding of research regarding the relationship between academic mindsets, academic behaviors, and academic outcomes. And as part of this, we want to share the findings from our recently published study regarding academic mindsets and behaviors and students' transitions to middle school in Clark County School District. First, let's talk briefly about some of the things we already know about academic mindsets and middle school transitions. One thing that's always important to keep in mind is that the transition to middle school really presents challenges for many, if not most students. Students often struggle with anxiety, a lack of sense of belonging, and a set of new challenges caused by dealing with the significant leap in both academic and social demands and complexity. These challenges often result in declines in GPA and attendance throughout middle school. In fact, sometimes these declines last through high school. Importantly, these declines are much steeper for lower achieving students, as well as for Black, Latinx, and English learner students. This exacerbates existing achievement gaps between these groups and their counterparts. As we think about these transitions, grades are a key marker of success. As much as achievement scores, grades are a significant predictor of whether or not students are doing well and how well they'll do in the future. For example, whether or not students have a GPA below 2.0 in the 8th grade is a significant indicator of whether or not they're ready for the transition to high school and will end up on or off track for graduation at the end of the 9th grade. And whether or not students have a GPA below 2.0 in the 6th grade predicts how well they tend to do in the 8th grade. And this is true despite the fact that teachers tend to grade differently. So, an ever-growing body of research suggests that psychosocial factors, including academic mindsets and behaviors, play a major role in student success in general and that they may be particularly important in the transition to middle school. This research, including multiple randomized trials, suggests that a subset of psychosocial factors can drive academic behaviors, thereby increasing student success. So, what do we mean by academic mindsets? Academic mindsets are a subset of psychosocial factors and include things like growth mindset and evaluative anxiety or performance avoidance, among other factors. Growth mindset, as folks may know, is essentially the belief that you can change your performance and your academic skill through effort. For example, to the extent that students report that they believe that doing homework and putting forth more effort can improve their academic outcomes, they're thought of as having a more or higher level of growth mindset. To the extent they believe that their ability is fixed and that their effort doesn't matter, they're thought of as having an entity theory of intelligence or a fixed ability mindset. On the other side of growth mindset is something that we are calling performance avoidance or evaluative anxiety. This is essentially the fear of failure and embarrassment in school, which often generates a withdrawal from the academic behaviors that can support student success. For example, some students are afraid to participate in class for fear of giving a wrong answer and feeling embarrassed or being ridiculed by their peers. Or they may even be afraid to put forth effort on homework for fear that they might feel like they are, quote, not smart, unquote, if they can't complete a task that they're expected to be able to do, or that if they're afraid that they aren't smart enough, that they'll be validating that expectation or that belief by not doing well on an assignment. We refer to this throughout the report as performance avoidance, in part because we measure this using responses to questions about how frequently students avoid certain behaviors and certain activities, like participating actively in class. However, we think we are, at least in part, really measuring the underlying anxiety. So we think of students as having positive academic mindsets if they exhibit high levels of growth mindset and low levels of performance avoidance. The theory of action underlying the work around growth mindsets and academic behaviors suggests that the extent to which students have positive academic mindsets supports and generates higher levels of engagement in school and manifests itself as positive academic behaviors. That is, showing up to class prepared, doing homework, doing assigned reading, actively participating in class, etc. These behaviors result in increased academic success, which in turn reinforces the academic mindsets that promote success in the first place, creating a positive recursive cycle or a virtuous cycle, as some researchers have described it. On the other hand, this cycle can be just as easily disrupted or reversed by negative experiences or a lack of success and how that's handled. For example, if students put forth effort and maybe fall short because of a lack of skill and adequate preparation for the task, and receive negative feedback from their teachers without any encouragement, or they are ridiculed by their peers, they can begin to conclude that their effort doesn't matter and develop a fear of failure, undermining growth mindset and triggering performance avoidance or more evaluative anxiety. Of course, this results in less engagement, poor academic performance, and then more likely negative feedback, which can create a sort of negative recursive cycle. So exploring and understanding these relationships and these cycles is part of what motivated the study we'll be talking about today. Before we move into the findings we're presenting today, we wanted to provide some more context for the findings. Among the reasons this study focuses on academic mindsets and behaviors is that evidence from prior studies in Clark County and elsewhere suggests that measures of student academic mindsets and behaviors in the 8th grade were strong predictors of how well students do in high school. If you look at the figure here, on the horizontal axis, we have 8th grade self-reported scores on student growth mindset and academic behavior. So these are indices that result from multiple questions, and the scores range from 1 to 5, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. The vertical axis is the probability that students would be on track for graduation at the end of the 8th grade. So here we're seeing the relationship between 8th grade academic mindsets and behaviors and 9th grade on track status. The blue bars represent the probabilities associated with scores on the growth mindset scale, while the orange bars represent the probabilities associated with the scores on the academic behavior scale. And again, these are all student self-reports from the 8th grade. The pattern we can see is that the probability that students who end up on track for high school graduation in the 9th grade is higher for students with higher 8th grade self-reports of growth mindset and academic behaviors. For example, students with the lowest value of growth mindset had a 48% probability of being on track for high school graduation at the end of the 9th grade, and students with the lowest scores of positive academic behaviors had a 31% probability of being on track for high school graduation at the end of the 9th grade. On the other hand, students who had higher self-reports, who scored the highest on the scale, did a lot better. Students who scored the highest on the scale of growth mindset had an 83% probability of being on track for the 9th grade, and students who scored highest on the self-reports of academic behaviors had an 87% probability of being on the 9th grade. So this is though this is clear, this is not from a causal study, we do see a strong relationship between self-reports of academic mindsets and behaviors in the 8th grade and school success at the end of the first year of high school. The study we'll talk about today sort of extends this work by examining the relationship between academic mindsets and behaviors in the 5th grade and how well students make the transition to middle school. One of the other things we pay a lot of attention to in this study is GPA. And one of the reasons is that previous research in Clark County and elsewhere suggests that 8th grade GPA is a significant predictor of whether or not students are off track as they make the transition to high school. And not surprisingly, there's evidence that 6th grade GPA in particular predicts how well students do in the 8th grade. So the more we understand the factors that contribute to low GPA in the middle school, the earlier we can begin to provide effective supports for student success. Yet another reason to focus on 6th grade GPA is that it varies significantly across different student groups in ways that have important implications for equity. For example, looking at 6th grade GPA, we can see that this is from Clark County School District. We can see that Black, Latinx, Native American students, and English learners were several times more likely than their white nation counterparts to have a low GPA in the first semester of 6th grade. For example, among grade 5 students, 33% of Black students, 22% of Latinx students, and 43% of English learner students had GPAs below 2.0. This compares to just 6% of Asian students and 10% of white students. With this in mind, we focused on the connection between 5th grade academic mindsets and behaviors on the one hand and first semester 6th grade GPA on the other. Okay, with that, I'll turn it over to Alex, who will talk about the results of the most recent study.
All right, great. Thanks, Jason. So for this section, I'm going to just share a little overview of the study that we conducted in Clark County School District. And in particular, I'm going to talk about some key terms, give a brief overview of the methods, and talk about the key findings. So just to begin with, we'll start with key terms. And as Jason mentioned, our analysis really focused on the transition into middle school. And so for the purposes of our study, an unsuccessful transition into middle school was defined as having a GPA below 2.0 in the first semester of 6th grade. So in other words, if a student was failing by the end of their first semester of 6th grade, then their transition was unsuccessful. Our analysis also considered prior academic achievement, and we define this as the average 5th grade SBAC scores across mathematics and English language arts subjects. And for part of our analysis, we also grouped students into 3 prior achievement groups, those below the 25th percentile or within the first quartile across the district, those from the 25th to the 50th percentile or the second quartile, and those at or above the 51st percentile or the top 2 quartiles. So looking at test scores across the district, we identified which of these 3 groups a student fell into. Also discussed by Jason is the fact that our study is focusing on academic mindsets and behaviors and their potential role in how successfully a student transitions to middle school. And we really defined 3 specific measures of this. And Jason went over these, but just as a reminder, this includes performance avoidance, which is the extent to which a student tends to reduce or reject effort to avoid failure or embarrassment. Growth mindset, which is the extent to which a student believes intelligence and academic ability is not fixed but malleable. and academic behaviors, which include behaviors relevant to academic performance, such as those mentioned by Jason, regular attendance, participation, or completion. And one thing I'll reiterate is just that these mindsets and behaviors, some are positive, some are not. So growth mindset academic behaviors are generally thought to be positive, the more the better, whereas performance avoidance is viewed as a negative thing. And so the less evident that is, the better. Considering the fact that, from our perspective, we thought of these three measures as being reflective of the overall, how positive a student's academic mindsets and behaviors are overall, we also define three levels of positive academic mindsets and behaviors. High, median, and low, high being the most positive and reflecting a high level of growth mindsets and academic behaviors, and a low level of performance avoidance. So more of the positive measures and less of the negative measure. Conversely, a low level was defined as the least positive, and it was included low levels of growth mindset and academic behaviors, and a high level of performance avoidance. And then the median level would just be sort of in between those two, with a median value of all three measures. One thing I'll note about these before we move on to the next slide is just that these three levels were defined for our study as points in the distribution as opposed to groups of students. So unlike prior academic achievement, which was defining sections of the distribution and determining which of those the student fell into, this was actually defining specific points for each level in the distribution. All right, so just now to take a bit of a step back, I want to talk about our overall study goals. And the first of these was, as Jason mentioned, to examine this potential, to examine if there's a relationship between fifth grade academic mindsets and behaviors and the probability that a student would have an unsuccessful transition to middle school. And part of this included taking into account a student's prior academic achievement, bearing in mind that this prior academic achievement may be related to both the probability of the unsuccessful transition and the level of grade 5 academic mindsets and behaviors. Our second goal was then to think about the extent to which, or examine if, this relationship differed by groups of students, and in particular, with respect to prior academic achievement and sociodemographic characteristics. So for example, do we see a different relationship between academic mindsets and behaviors and the probability of an unsuccessful transition for students in the bottom quartile compared to those in the top two, for example? So now to say a little bit about our methods. To estimate this relationship we're focused on, we used a statistical technique that allowed us to predict the probability of a particular outcome, in this case, an unsuccessful transition to middle school, given a set of relevant factors, in this case, academic mindsets and behaviors and prior academic achievement. And we used a multi-level model to account for the nesting of students in schools. For data sources, we included administrative data from Clark County School District, including demographics and fifth grade test scores from 2016-17 and sixth grade grades from 2017-18 for the same students, so following students from the 16-17 school year to the 17-18. We also used fifth grade district-wide survey data from Clark County School District's 2017 student survey. And that was the basis for the measures of performance avoidance, growth mindset, and academic behaviors. And Jason already kind of talked through some of the particular items on that survey that contributed to each of those. But just to reiterate, for students, in terms of performance avoidance, students with higher levels of performance avoidance tended to self-report that statements like, I don't participate in discussions because I'm afraid people might think I'm foolish. They reported that to be more true than their peers. So higher levels of performance avoidance for those statements being more true. For growth mindset, statements like my intelligence is something I can't change very much was less true than peers for students with high levels of growth mindset. And for students with higher levels of academic behaviors, we observed that they reported in a typical class that they more often, for example, turned in assignments on their due date than their peers. Just to give a sense of some of the kinds of items that contributed to those measures. Of course, there are multiple items for each. All right, so with all of that said, I'm now going to dig into some of our key findings. And the findings I'm going to talk about really center on that second goal of the study, whether the relationship of focus differed for students in different groups, especially prior academic achievement groups. So the first thing I'm going to do is just give an overview of the chart, just to make sure that it's clear what we're presenting here. The vertical axis is reflecting the percent probability of an unsuccessful transition to middle school. And the horizontal axis is identifying results within the 3 prior achievement groups, the bottom quartile, second quartile, and the top 2 quartiles. So for example, looking at the first set of 3 columns here, the far left blue column reflects the percent probability of an unsuccessful transition for students with a low level of positive mindsets and behaviors within that bottom quartile group. And in this case, that's 47%. Moving to the right, the reddish pink column in the middle is reflecting the percent probability of an unsuccessful transition for students with a median level of positive mindsets and behaviors, in this case, 40%. And the black column is reflecting the percent probability of an unsuccessful transition for students with a high level of positive mindsets and behaviors, in this case, 34%. All 3 of those being just for the students in the bottom quartile in prior academic achievement. So now taking a look at these findings for this group, it's clear that the unsuccessful transition is significantly less likely based on our analysis for students with low positive mindsets and behaviors compared to those with high levels. So this is a move from 47% for those with low levels of positive mindsets and behaviors to 34% for those with high levels of positive mindsets and behaviors, a difference of 13 percentage points. Moving over to the second quartile, we see similar, though more modest results, finding that the percent probability of an unsuccessful transition is again much higher for those with low level of mindsets and behaviors at 18% in this case, than for those with high levels of positive mindsets and behaviors at 11%. So a smaller but still significant difference of 7 percentage points. So finally, looking at the top 2 quartiles, we find no significant difference in predicted probability. Looking at the low levels of mindsets and behaviors, we see 3% probability of an unsuccessful transition, and that only drops to 2% for students with high levels. So we really don't find a significant difference in these top 2 quartiles. So now what all of that suggests is that this relationship between academic mindsets and behaviors and the probability that a student will unsuccessfully transition to middle school, based on our analysis, is most significant among students with lower prior achievement. The last thing I'll share is just that these results, we did look at this for particular student sociodemographic groups, including race, ethnicity, and language group. And we did not find that within each achievement band, the results were meaningfully different. So in other words, differences in how significantly academic mindsets and behaviors predict probability of unsuccessful transition didn't seem to depend within these achievement bands on a student's race, ethnicity, or language group. However, it should be noted, as presented earlier, we know that in Clark County School District, Black and English learners in particular are clustered in the lower 2 achievement groups. And so the results for these groups are still particularly significant, notwithstanding the fact that within achievement band, the results do not differ by a subgroup. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Jason.
Thank you, Alex. We're going to talk through some of the implications of these findings and try to put them in context now. So let's get into some of the maybe potential takeaways and implications. The fact that these particular measures of academic mindsets and behaviors are so strongly associated with differences in whether or not students made a successful transition to middle school and had a GPA that exceeded or was below 2.0 suggests that psychosocial factors are really important considerations in preparing students for transitioning to middle school. And with that in mind, districts may want to consider strategies that explicitly support academic mindsets and behaviors, maybe including interventions that target academic mindsets as students make the transition to middle school. And this is likely to be particularly important for Black, Latinx, Indigenous, and English learners, as they are more likely to enter middle schools with lower than average test scores. This is true in Clark County and elsewhere. And this is where we find the strong relationships between academic mindsets and the success with which students make the transition to middle school. Nevertheless, if we think about applying this in practice, it's probably important, very important, not to overtly target these students for interventions, as that can result in sort of stereotyping and stigmatization that can further undermine the academic success and, in fact, undermine the effectiveness of the interventions themselves. So school-wide, grade-wide, or district-wide strategies are more likely appropriate, though they will have a disproportionate benefit for low-achieving students, Black, Latinx students, and English language learners, excuse me. It's also important that districts attend to instructional quality at the elementary level so that students are equipped with the skills they need to succeed in school. We see that from the dramatic differences in the percentage of students who end up with high and low GPAs based on where they are in terms of their academic skills relative to the rest of the district. And that they do whatever they can to strengthen teachers' adoption of a growth mindset perspective. Previous research, and we'll discuss a little bit later, shows that this appears to support the development of positive academic mindsets in students and make efforts to generate those positive mindsets more successful. And obviously, we should continue to measure these factors so that we can understand where students are and how their performance, or rather how their reports on academic mindsets and behaviors connects to their success in the transition to middle school. So, as districts work to implement strategies to support positive academic mindsets and behaviors, they should really take advantage of the fact that there are multiple randomized trials showing that several low-cost, easily implemented interventions that target academic mindsets generate significant improvements in grades, attendance, and other outcomes. This graph here is an example from a randomized trial of a strategy called WISE critical feedback, and it's just an illustration of how some of these interventions work. These often work by reversing or slowing down declines that are occurring as students move through middle school. In this example, from the randomized trial focused on the type of feedback teachers were instructed to give students, is where the treatment group of teachers was given instructions to, when they provided negative feedback, say, I'm giving you this feedback because I believe you can succeed. Whereas the control group of teachers was asked to give sort of feedback as usual. The GPA for the treatment and control groups both decline prior to the intervention, but that decline is reversed for the treatment group, generating a positive impact on GPA. Again, it's worth noting that in many cases, these interventions and the impacts of these interventions grow over time for years after the interventions themselves are over. And it's thought that this occurs due to the creation of the type of positive recursive cycle we discussed earlier. That's also the reason that sometimes interventions that seem to be very targeted and low cost and relatively minor in terms of the duration seem to have effects that actually generate meaningful difference in the student outcomes. However, school contexts can either support or disrupt these cycles. One recent study suggests that average self-reports of teacher growth mindsets may affect the extent to which interventions targeting growth mindsets in students generate impacts on student outcomes. And finally, it's important to note, as has been pointed out by several scholars in this area, that these interventions are really not a substitute for addressing instructional issues, and that good instruction is an important enabling factor for these interventions to work. So before we end the presentation segment of the webinar, we did want to list some interventions that have been shown to succeed in randomized trials. Each of these interventions that you see in the slide here has been studied and found to yield significant impacts on student academic and or disciplinary outcomes. We'll put the links to these studies, these interventions in the chat. They will also be available soon in a soon to be published infographic summarizing the results of this study. So one example is the belonging intervention. It's a series of writing exercises designed to validate the challenges students tend to experience when they make the transition to middle school, and providing them with examples and stories of students overcoming these transitions, these challenges. Another intervention is the self-affirmation intervention. It's been shown to be effective in multiple randomized trials. It's a set of 2 to 4 brief written exercises focused on affirming aspects of students' personal values and identities, in particular aspects of those values and identities that do not necessarily relate to school. This has been shown to diffuse some of the significant negative effects of stereotype threat, which can undermine the achievement of African American and Latinx students, or has been shown to do so, and has generated impacts on GPA, attendance, discipline, and impacts that in fact grown over time, and in some studies lasted through the 12th grade and generated impacts on graduation and college readiness. The growth mindset intervention is a short online intervention highlighting the fact that intellectual abilities can be developed and improved through effort. On the teacher side of this, empathic instruction / empathic discipline is a teacher-focused, short, interactive training designed to encourage teachers to reflect on their disciplinary practices and empathize with students experiencing disciplinary challenges. Though they aren't asked to agree with students' perspective, the act of taking the perspective of the student has been shown to generate significant impacts on exclusionary discipline, reducing out-of-school suspensions among Black students by 50% and reducing Black-white disparities in out-of-school suspensions by more than 50%. And finally, wise critical feedback, which we briefly discussed earlier, supports teachers as they try to refine the way they provide feedback so that they emphasize not just the feedback, but the beliefs around students' potential to succeed. So that's the sort of formal presentation part. And now we would really like to hear from you for a bit, and then we'll do a little Q&A. But before we do the formal Q&A, we'd like for folks just to take a minute to share any reflections on the study findings and how they might inform policy and practice in your work.
Hi, Jason, this is Lisa, and I'm looking at many of these responses and I'm seeing a lot of people really sort of wanting to learn more about interventions and how this looks like. We've got thoughts around incorporating mindset interventions into everyday instruction, rather than thinking them as activities that are inserted inside. So kind of like melding them and integrating them more. So this is all very useful. Some other ones here. And that this is very much an important topic of conversation, including behaviorist interventions versus constructivist whole class practices. So we're getting quite a lot of comments.
I see someone else mentioned that the concept of performance avoidance is new to them, or at least the formal definition of it, and they're interested in learning more about it. I think it is really important relative to growth mindset. It's sort of, this comes from a survey developed by Camille Farrington and her team at University of Chicago. And it's, again, sort of the inverse of growth mindset. And it is particularly important because it intersects with equity issues. We know from lots of work by many folks, including Claude Steele and Joshua Aronson, that evaluative anxiety plays a different role for Black, Latinx, and other stereotype groups than it does for non-stereotype students. So the idea that performance avoidance undermines the extent to which you're willing to exert effort because you're afraid, and then resulting in sort of, weaker performance and more negative feedback, et cetera, is a really important thing that is important to deal with for equity issues. And it really manifests itself a great deal, as Carol Dweck's work shows, as students make the transition to middle school, when students are more likely kind of to develop these sort of entity theory, fixed mind intelligence theories of intelligence.
Great. Now I'm thinking that we have such wonderful questions appearing that it's probably time to move on to our Q&A. And I wanted to thank you, Jason and Alex, for an insightful presentation. Let's take some time to respond to participants' questions and open discussion for the remainder of the session. We've received many in both the Q&A and chat, so I'm going to begin in order of receipt. And what I have here is an interesting question. Can we determine if the growth mindset determines the academic mindset, or if the academic mindset affects the growth mindset.
I think this is a definitional problem. Growth mindset is a subset of just something that we're calling academic mindsets. So growth mindset, performance avoidance are all part of academic mindsets. There are a couple other factors. But in terms of maybe the idea is whether or not the growth mindset determines the academic behaviors versus the academic behaviors determining the growth mindset. I think that the causality probably goes both ways. I think that it is the case, though, that we know that randomized trials of interventions that target academic mindsets, that target growth mindset, have generated improvements in academic outcomes, particularly GPA, and those primarily happen and can only happen really through, primarily happen through changes in students' actual activities, doing more homework, etc. But it also can happen through how well students do those activities. So if you think about the stereotype threat, rather the self-affirmation intervention, the mechanism through which this evaluative anxiety, among the mechanisms through which it works, is not just that students are less likely to engage in academic behaviors, but also students are less effective because their cognitive energy or their cognitive space is taken up by the fear of failure. We can think of many sports analogies. If someone's on a free throw line thinking about whether or not they're going to miss instead of just their technique, they're much more likely to miss. And similarly, we find that when we trigger evaluative anxiety, which is again more likely to happen if you have if you have entity theory of intelligence, we see that students' stress responses, both physiological and psychological, increase, and that makes it harder for them to perform academically on things like standardized tests or even just assessments in classroom that are within class, course-based assessments. So I think there's reason to think that, of course, causality flows both ways, which is why it's a cycle. But that if we intervene at a particular point in the cycle, there's experimental evidence to show that we can if we change the mindset, we can improve the academic behavior or improve the effectiveness of the behavior and therefore improve the outcome.
Thank you, Jason. Our next question is asking about validity. When measuring beliefs and mindsets like this, were there any concerns from your research team or outside of your research team regarding the validity of measuring beliefs or mindsets from participating adolescent age students?
The fact that these were, yes, there's always concerns about that. The fact that these were so strongly correlated with the outcomes that of interest across multiple studies, and the fact that there had been reliability and validity studies conducted by Farrington's team made us, more confident that these, were measures that were valid predictors. That being said, one thing again, and this study is, definitely, an example of this. One thing we cannot be sure of entirely is the direction of causality. So I want us to be very clear that we're showing an association, but although I don't think this is necessarily the case, it is not impossible that this is all driven by the academic behaviors and that those drive the mindsets and that those in turn drive the outcomes or what have you. The direction of causality is not determined, but in terms of the measurements, these have been shown to be internally consistent and predictors of behaviors and outcomes. That is the measures of academic mindsets in us and other studies, and that we've done and other folks have done.
Thank you. The next question, we have three more, which are pretty rich. Are there any plans to connect this research to the value and application of metacognitive learning strategies through teacher interventions that coach metacognitive teaching strategies at the middle school level to prepare students for a more self-directed mindset when they transition to high school?
There are no plans for that, but that's a great question. I can think of interventions like the Strategic Literacy Initiative that get folks or reading apprenticeship that encourage students to think about their thinking. And I can imagine that would do a couple of things. One, the fact that you're explicitly helping students to, in class, talk about how they're learning could diffuse students' concerns about performance avoidance, particularly if it's done in a way, if the classroom norms are appropriate, if appropriate classroom norms are established. Secondly, observing, and talking about how you're learning and how you're thinking, I think could support the notion of a growth mindset. I think that's a great idea and something that maybe could be studied. I'd love to think about, trying to study that, but there are no plans right at this time.
Great. Thank you, Jason. Jason, this and Alex, this question is kind of along the lines of wanting to know more about other studies and interventions. Are you aware of any studies of the interaction between testing and performance avoidance? For example, lower test score leading to increased performance avoidance, high test score leading to growth mindset.
I am not, but there's nothing new under the sun. Every time I dig into something, I wouldn't be surprised if it was found.
Excellent. And then this question here is an alignment. It's asking, is there an alignment between positive academic mindset, for example, growth mindset, and socio-emotional psychosocial development? Or are they just different names?
I think a lot of this is terminology. I've stayed away from socio-emotional learning, for example, as a term, because it can mean a lot of different things. And there are a lot of things that fall into the category of social-emotional learning that have to do with things like feelings of safety at school, physical safety, and other dimensions of emotional well-being. But I think that these things are related. If you think about the belonging study, it doesn't address growth mindset specifically, maybe addresses performance avoidance, but it does address feelings of school belonging and has been shown to have significant positive effects. So there are, other interventions. These aren't the only mindsets, and I tried to make that clear earlier. These aren't the only mindsets that would put under the category of academic mindsets or under the category of psychosocial factors that would affect that could affect student achievement. And even if you look at Jason O'Connor's work on empathic discipline, what you see is that, this is an intervention that helps teachers take students' perspectives, right? And that has reduced, exclusionary discipline by significant amounts among Black and Latinx students. But this is a middle school intervention that targeted one of their teachers. So if the only change was among teachers, you wouldn't necessarily expect significant results. And one of the hypotheses that folks have put forth, I think Jason O'Connor has put this forth himself, but I won't swear to that. Don't want to put words in his mouth. Is that having one adult you can trust in the school really matters for kids' behavior. And of course, there's all sorts of research connecting exclusionary discipline to other negative academic outcomes. So what I'm saying is that this is sort of part of the family of things you'd think of as psychosocial learning, or socio-emotional, learning. But as we're talking about a specific subset today.
Thank you, Jason. We do have several questions here that ask or relate to counselors and their place within these studies. And one of them that we have here, Jason, is, were school counselors surveyed as part of the study? School counselor standards for student success include mindsets and behaviors. How are schools working with their school counselors on this? And another question also asked about the standards for school counseling.
I think that one of the positive implications is that as we're thinking about school counseling, sort of understanding the extent to which, students are experiencing certain, feelings of lack of belonging, of anxiety, et cetera, is important. We counselors were not surveyed as part of this study. There is a parallel teacher survey that's been done, and there is an opportunity, potentially to do more work connecting teachers to that. However, I think that the response rates among teachers are a little bit lower, and so it might be a little bit harder to do that work.
And Alex, the next set of questions are really about sort of your thoughts And the first one, which is really interesting, is thoughts on engaging families to support positive mindsets and behaviors. What do you think about this? What's been done or said about this, and how does this apply?
So I think this is a really good question. I don't know that there's been enough research on this. I do know that there's some approaches like Power My Learning and some others where they've really tried to engage families in the learning process, and have the students be the folks who actually take a lesson home and run their family through it. And it sort of put the student in the driver's seat a little bit. And I think that, the potential mechanisms, of action through which this kind of approach can work include improving a student's sense of agency, as well as their sense of sort of belonging, and reducing their kind of anxiety around that work, because they're working on it sitting at home with their folks, and then they bring that back to class, and with an increased level of sort of confidence and competence that may increase their willingness to engage and reduce their anxiety. But this is all, this is all hypothetical. And I don't think that's been studied formally. I do think that, I guess I'd say I can't swear at this point today that no one studied interventions targeting academic mindsets by targeting families. My guess is that someone has. I'm not necessarily familiar with that work. My guess is it has been studied. While I'm talking, one of the comments that was made in there, on a slightly different note, is that with student-teacher ratios being what they are, finding the trusting or have a teacher to trust might be impractical for many teachers. But what's really happening, you see in the empathic instruction intervention, it's not that they're spending the time to develop a close personal relationship with the students, but rather when they talk to students about disciplinary, discipline, they reflect the fact that they actually, understand what students have actually, that they understand where they're coming from. They aren't validating that their perspective is correct, but they're just showing that they understand it, instead of just, labeling them as a troublemaker. And so that may not be as much of a question of volume as much as it is habit of behavior.
What are your thoughts about changing the narrative from interventions to enrichment? Because the connotation impacts mindset.
I think I might leave that to people who are closer to the ground and closer to practice in terms of what they see. I think we could actually study that, I guess, a little bit. I think it matters more that, if a change in terminology increases the extent to which schools, districts, teachers, principals are willing to adopt these approaches, then I'm all for it. I see the logic behind what you're saying, because, we don't want to think about, implying that there's kind of a deficit among students or whatever. And certain language around intervention, it can suggest that there is such a deficit. I think it's also really important to make a distinction between the conversations that we have among adults and the conversations that we have when these interventions are put in place in classrooms. In many cases, if they're actually put in place and described as interventions, they are less likely to work. In some of these studies, they intentionally avoid describing this as an intervention or anything. They just do it as part of a classroom activity, and everyone does it. And when they stray from that, and it looks like a research activity or a special activity, then it's less likely to have an effect. This is something that I think Yeager and Walton talked about. I hope I have that right. Where they're saying that for these interventions to work, they need to be stealthy. And this was, I think, in a 2011, might be in the 2011 paper that they wrote on something about psychosocial interventions. They're not magic. I think it's the title is something like that. So if you're thinking about them being stealthy, which I don't know if is the right word, but thinking about not emphasizing a deficit perspective, and just not emphasizing a difference between this and classroom practice, so that, because that will actually magnify the effect of this if we de-emphasize that, then I'm all for terminology that works better for practitioners and makes this seem more seamless.
Thank you, Jason. And we're going to be wrapping up fairly soon. I just want to sneak in one more question. It was more of a practical question, and it asks if we have any trainings on how to incorporate these strategies for teachers.
So one of the trainings that exists is, the empathic instruction, empathic discipline training. And that is actually that intervention is available and through outreach to Jason O'Conifau at UC Berkeley. And there may be an opportunity through West Ed if folks want to reach out offline to us. As far as the other interventions go, one of the main benefits is that they require no teacher professional development to implement. Maybe in one of them, there's like a 15-minute session that teachers do to orient them, but really in some of these things, for the belonging interventions and for the self-affirmation interventions, there are simply things that teachers can do, exercises they can hand out in the course of their work without much professional learning. I think the professional learning that's probably needed is professional learning about how these things can actually generate a change in students' outcomes, so that teachers and principals, district administrators, et cetera, are more interested in focusing on them.
Thank you, Jason. And thank you, Alex. I think we're going to be wrapping up, and I want to thank everybody for participating in REL West webinar on academic mindsets and behaviors, prior achievement, and transition to middle school. We will send the presentation slides and a survey link shortly after the webinar, so please watch for emails from relwest@wested.org. Again, thank you for joining us. If anyone would like to stick around and have a more informal discussion with Jason and Alex, you are very welcome to join us for another 30 minutes. We will stay on here and continue with questions and answers. Thank you, everybody.